Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavitah Waib. In this week's episode, we will look at the illegal arms trade and its economic impact. Specifically, which countries top the list in this trade and whether the intentions of these countries are to derail the government in charge for their own political gains. Data from SIPRI's arms industry database shows that arms sales by the world's 25 largest arms producers actually rose to $361 billion for the year 2019. This represented an 8.5% increase in real terms over the arms sales for the year 2018. By the way, we're going to feature an interview I had with the world-famous SIPRI Institute President Jan Eliasson. Now, taking a look at the country known for huge military sales, the U.S. The U.S. does not even hide the fact that arms transfers have been a primary instrument of their foreign policy since the Nixon Doctrine. Additionally, the U.S. says it's an easy way to win friends and to influence people. Well, perhaps none of that is new, but it is worth noting why we thought there should be a program on this. Because not only are the weapons falling into the wrong hands, economies, they're getting destroyed in the process. Our first report, a look at an alarming development involving arms and the famous military contractor Z Services, formerly known as Blackwater. Private security contractor and ally of former U.S. President Donald Trump, Eric Prince, was back in the news, and again for the wrong reasons.
Is that these weapon sales, as you said, got the okay from the U.S. authorities or from some authorities.
He had violated a UN arms embargo on Libya. A confidential report to the Security Council said that Prince deployed a force of foreign mercenaries and weapons to strongman Khalifa Haftar, who has fought to overthrow the UN-backed Libyan government in 2019. The $80 million operation included plans to form a hit squad to track and kill Libyan commanders opposed to Haftar. Eric Prince offered to supply weapons, drones, and mercenaries to a Libyan militia commander seeking to overthrow the government.
Is being continued by the British and the Biden administration that they implement probably to destabilize the talks that are going on now to create a unified government.
Libya has been a source of illicit weapons transfer for Africa, especially to northern Africa. These are some of the documented flows of weapons and non-state armed personnel in the Sahel from the years 2011 through 2017, which concentrate on North Africa. It is no surprise that conflict remains Africa's biggest challenge, with such quantities of illicit arms flowing in the continent. Joining me in the studio is current affairs and impact analyst Mahan Abedin. And we also have Carl Osgood, who's the editor of EIR Executive Intelligence Review. Now, this is the weekly news publication of Lyndon LaRouche. He's also the Washington correspondent who has written on military affairs, veterans, health affairs, municipal affairs, homelessness, and other social issues. Okay, I'd like to welcome you both. Let me first start with you, Carl, and talk about how the topic of this program came about. Eric Prince, a Trump ally, to have violated the Libyan arms embargo based on a UN report. It said that Prince offered to supply weapons, drones, and mercenaries to Libya militia commander seeking to overthrow the governments, according to UN investigators. Doesn't this imply that Prince was actually acting either on behalf of the U.S. government or got the okay from the U.S. government to go ahead with supplying these weapons and military equipment to advance the U.S. agenda, in this case in Libya?
Well, I mean, officially the U.S. government was actually supportive of the Tripoli government in Libya, not of Khalifa Haftar. As far as Prince goes, he probably thought he had government support because he was a supporter of Donald Trump, and his sister, Betsy DeVos, was Trump's education secretary.
Mahan, when we take a look at what happened here, the news that came out regarding Prince, I don't think he's a very well-liked person in some respects, but the U.S. government seems to fancy him. Now, do you agree, or do you get the sense that he's maybe doing the dirty work for the U.S. government, in this case in Libya? I mean, it was the U.S. that actually led NATO war in Libya, as you're well aware. It destroyed the country, destroyed its economy, and the U.S. is still not letting go of it.
Yeah, well, this is, Prince is like, he's the symbol, if you like, of this new form of warfare, subcontracting warfare to these private companies. Now, to be fair, many countries are doing it. It's not just the Americans. But what's making the American initiative so controversial is because it's just so messy, illegal, and so bloody. I mean, this guy, Prince, he's responsible for killing at least 17 Iraqis in a notorious incident in 2007.
All right, at this point, we're going to take a look at the second report and see who are these manufacturers that are selling and spreading their weapons around the world, especially when it comes to the West Asia region, where sales just keeps soaring, and the U.S. continues to be the #1 weapons supplier. The world is awash with weapons. Amnesty and other rights groups have always highlighted this.
Every year, around $100 billion worth of weapons are traded around the world.
There are clear rules against arms transfers to third parties. Being the top arms manufacturer in the world, does the U.S. monitor where its arms end up? Time and again, U.S. military equipment has been transferred from Saudi Arabia and the UAE to a variety of militias, including some linked to Al-Qaeda.
20 years is the policy pushed again by the British and the American administration to have endless wars in the Middle East. This dates back to 1996, when Tony Blair, at a speech in Chicago, said, we have to end the sovereignty of nation states. This is dangerous for us. And this is what they've been implementing in the Middle East. And that's what the weapon sales are about.
The U.S. also has a history of supplying weapons and military training to regimes that commit deaths and in some cases massacres, like Saudi Arabia and Israel. The issue of Israel's trade with rogue regimes has been thrust into the spotlight after revelations that it was sending weapons to Myanmar in defiance of a U.S. and European arms embargo. Israeli firms have also broken with the U.S. and Europe by supplying weapons and surveillance equipment to militias in South Sudan.
We're prepared to give evidence of massive criminal behavior by the President of South Sudan and by his opposition, the ousted Vice President of South Sudan, and their generals. The simple fact is, they're stealing the money to fund their militias to attack and kill one another. The evidence is thorough, it is detailed, and it is irrefutable. It involves arms dealers, international lawyers, international banks, international real estate.
Back with me in the studio is Mahan Abedin and Carl Osgood, editor of EIR Executive Intelligence Review. Welcome, gentlemen. Carl, the illicit weapon sales effects are seen in conflict zones, especially in West Asia or the Middle East. The U.S. Is in many of these conflict zones. U.S. military manufacturers hold the top spots for weapons manufacturers. Does this by default mean that the U.S. is behind illicit weapons sales, either directly, covertly, or otherwise? I mean, please note that numerous reports have revealed, for example, that U.S. weapons have actually fallen into the wrong hands, like Al-Qaeda, through U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia or the UAE.
Well, of course, the U.S. has been indirectly involved in illicit weapons sales, but the U.S. is hardly the only country that does this. I mean, there's British weapons, French weapons, Israeli weapons. Israeli weapons have been found in Syria. The Syrian government keeps turning up caches of weapons in areas formerly controlled by jihadi groups that include weapons from the U.S. and weapons from Israel. But also there are Chinese weapons, Russian weapons, and probably weapons from a lot of other places as well. And I recall that there were reports in 2013 about how the CIA was involved in running weapons, not American-made weapons, but Russian-made weapons from Eastern Europe to jihadi groups in Syria. So the manufacturer of a weapon that ends up in the hands of a jihadi militant doesn't tell you the whole story. He might be carrying an AK-47, but the AK-47 could have been arrived as a result of networks run by the CIA and other intelligence agencies. So it's, like I said, it's a murky world, and it's really more complicated than merely identifying the make of the weapon.
Yeah, it's a murky world indeed. Mohan, I want to take up with you the whole notion of arms ending up in the wrong hands. Accidents?
Your guest has a point. Up to a point, weapons ending up in the hands of insurgent or terrorist groups. Just looking at the origin of the weapon just tells you only part of the story. But I find it hard to believe, though, that this isn't somehow by design. I mean, there may be one or two cases where mistakes are made. Like Syria was a good example, where the Americans, through the CIA, were actually arming one faction, but then this faction was defeated by a more hardline faction, and they took over the weapons. Things like that happen, but the intelligence networks that are involved in this game, they know what they're doing, and of course they arm certain groups or certain factions in order to advance their country's foreign policy. And again, where I would disagree with your guest, again, is the US is an exception, actually, simply because, one, as I said before, the scaled up nature of these activities, and also the fact that, the private armies that the US seems to be promoting, sometimes they have a roguish agenda, because usually mercenary forces, they complement the forces of a state actor. They don't go rogue. Let's say a country is weak, it needs foreign mercenaries to come in to beef up its operations. So, but in Libya, for example, Prince, his group had a budget of $80 million. That's really quite significant in the mercenary world, and it just goes to show that they're running rogue operations, again, in pursuit of very distinct US foreign policies. Now, what the US objective in Syria was, we're not quite sure at the moment, but
still don't know what it is.
Yeah, but that's where I think the US involvement is more prominent than other countries.
All right, thanks to you, Mohan and Carl Osgood. At this point, we're going to take a short break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere, as we have plenty more coming up after these short messages, so stay right where you are. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kavatahwe. Time now to take a look at some of the other economic headlines hitting the front pages in our Info News section. Our first item concerns food waste and distribution. Capitalist economies overproducing food. Says the problem isn't that there isn't enough food to actually go around for everybody, but that more and more people are unable to afford to purchase it. That indeed is a big problem. On to another persistent problem, the garment industry. Brands and retailers that made a profit for the year 2020 could stop garment workers going hungry. And how can they do that? They can set up a severance fund by paying the equivalent of just 10 cents per t-shirt. Makes you think about it, doesn't it? Okay, next up, Syria's civil war. It started a decade ago. Now this is what has happened. The Syrian people are being crushed from Western sanctions. It's known as the Caesar Act, the most recent one. Also, sanctions are harming the Syrian people. Obviously, the economy suffering as a result. On to our final report. This goes to another war, the Yemen conflict, 6 years old since Saudi Arabia, backed by the U.S., actually attacked it, speeding towards a massive famine is what the UN has said. And of course, then the economic collapse as a result has been a major driver of instability in that country. Okay, time now to take a look at our final report of the show, which looks at how there's a huge disparity between what arms-producing countries preach, which is peace, when in actuality it is arms sales that are the main drivers, namely money to fill in their coffers for as long as anyone can remember. War is a racket, and nobody knows that better than the U.S. The U.S. military budget is more than 10 countries combined.
Not just the weapons manufacturers, which themselves are controlled by powerful financial organizations on Wall Street, but it's also a policy establishment. You have the think tanks, and the people from these think tanks go in and out of various administrations when the president changes. You know, you've heard about the neoconservatives. They're the extreme right wing of this establishment.
As long as conflicts continue, U.S. military sales will also continue. The controversy is in the conflicts themselves. Who's starting them? The U.S.'s so-called war on terror was a gift to the U.S. to not only expand its military bases, but to put in overdrive its military sales. It was recently disclosed that the Pentagon had expanded its secretive so-called war on terror to 80 countries. Meanwhile, the armed conflicts have cost the world economy dearly, $14.1 trillion in 2019. I'm pleased to welcome back one more time current affairs and impact analyst Mohan Abedin and Carl Osgood, editor at the EIR. Welcome back to you both. Carl, the saying, the war is a racket, something you're familiar with, I'm sure. The U.S. military budget, for example, is more than 10 countries combined. Military sales, big money makers, obviously, for the U.S. Is it correct to conclude that as long as conflicts continue, U.S. military sales will continue? The U.S. foreign policy perhaps may want to perpetuate these conflicts in which basically it has been called a war economy for the U.S.? Okay.
Well, Eisenhower, when he was his last speech before leaving the presidency, spoke of the military-industrial complex, and he warned that this thing could gain so much power that it would be deciding policies, and that is what has happened. Even Donald Trump spoke against that. U.S. weapons sales do help drive conflicts. But again, like I said before, this is not just the U.S. involved in this. There's also, the British practically invented this trade, the British Empire. There were hearings in the U.S. Congress in the 1920s about how British weapons were selling weapons to both sides in various conflicts. So this is an old problem. And it has to be, this is one of those things that has to be overthrown if we want to improve the relations among nations.
Okay, Mohan, war is a racket is a saying that's been prevalent in the U.S. We get it. But how about the downside? We're looking at forever wars, economies obliterated all over the world in terms of where U.S. is involved in one form or another, lives to have shattered. Any hope on the horizon to stop the U.S. on this war footing, if you may?
Well, again, your guest has a point up to a point. It's not just the U.S. that's involved in this racket. There are many players. And I think the bigger picture here, actually, is that warfare is in transition. Countries like the U.S. that can afford it, they are going to subcontract the uglier side of war fighting, if you like. And again, your guest brought up the UK. The UK brought up, actually released its integrated review of foreign and defense security policy just last week, where the focus is on developing lighter, nimbler forces, if you like, to carry out operations. And just yesterday, the British, for example, announced the creation of a new special operations force. So I think what we've seen in terms of mercenary fighting forces, this is actually going to increase in the future. It's not going to decrease, unfortunately.
Thank you very much for that. Mohan Abedin, current affairs and impact analyst, thank you for your thoughts. And we also like to thank Carl Osgood from the Executive Intelligence Review. Time now for 1,000 Words. SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, released the latest figures of its internal arms sales. There were both hope and disappointment. It said international arms transfers have actually leveled off after years of sharp growth. That is the good news. The bad news? West Asia or the Middle East arms imports grew the most. From what we can see here, the arms imports, as it's just stated, have grown by a lot. Substantial increases in transfers happened with 3 of the top 5 arms exporters. Now this graph over here shows just what we talked about in terms of how the West Asia or Middle East arms imports have grown the most from the years 1981 through 85 all the way down through 2016 to 2020. And you can see how it has leveled off based on what SIPRI has said. Well, as I mentioned before in our program, I had the pleasure of interviewing the SIPRI chairman, Dr. Jan Eliasson, at our studios during the Tehran Dialogue Forum. First, this is what he said about the most recent report that we just covered from his institute.
I want to start by telling you that I am chair of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and yesterday we published the latest report on arms trade. And it is interesting that it seems like arms trade is leveling off. It is already on a huge scale, of course. But what is disturbing is, if I refer to your region, the wider Middle East, you have an increase of 25% of arms to the region in the period 2016 and 20. It is a huge export led mostly by major powers, but it is also a sign, apropos what we just heard in the introduction, of a lack of trust, and that too much in today's world is based on trying to base security on military means, defense in the military sense.
Basing security on military means and a lack of trust, is what he said. Interesting. However, to the military manufacturers, does trust translate to sales, to revenues, or to dollars or euros? I don't think so. Anyways, this is what I asked him, which included SIPRI's latest report.
Well, thank you very much. One of my major points is, of course, that we have a chance, we have an opportunity now, in a strange and paradoxical way. We need to think about the world after COVID-19. What kind of world would we want to create? And we have the chance to do that. There is a new change, there's a change of administration in the US, and there is awareness that we need to take different directions. And I think we need to focus very strongly now on reducing this enormous mistrust.
The SIPRI chairman, Dr. Jan Eliasson, there with his comments, banking on COVID to change the countries selling arms, like he said the new US administration. Well, word of advice there, don't bank on it. Okay, I'm going to be right back now with my ending thoughts. The world is in a transition. COVID-19 has decimated economies around the world. Enough of wars. The war that needs to be won is against the pandemic and to overcome all the economic shortfalls and devastation, which is the consequence of these wars. But where there's money, there will be arms, and the U.S. stands there #1 on the list, both in terms of manufacturing arms and the sales of arms. If it's not selling it, it is providing huge sums of money in the form of foreign assistance. In the case of Israel, for example, it provides it with around $4 billion in military assistance each year. I would like to end the program with these thoughts by the Iranian foreign minister, which puts forward the notion of arms inequality into perspective.
The United States is selling billions, 50 billion last year, sold $50 billion of weapons to this region. Some of the countries in this region, with less than a third of our population, spend $87 billion on just military procurement. Let's just compare. Iran spent last year $16 billion on all of its military, with almost 1 million people under arms. We paid $16 billion. The United Arab Emirates, with a total 1 million population, indigenous population, spent $22 billion. Saudi Arabia spent $87 billion. Now, if we're talking about threats coming from countries in the region, the threat is coming from the United States and its Western allies, who are pouring weapons into this region, making it a tinderbox, ready to blow up.
That does it for this week's show. Hope you liked it. If there are any topics, thoughts, or issues that you would like us to cover and to discuss, please send it to our email address at the bottom of the screen. We would really appreciate it. From Mikhail and the whole team here on Economic Divide, it's goodbye until next week.